Good afternoon, good evening. I'm Kumi Kitamori, Deputy Director at the OECD Environment Directorate. Today, we'll be discussing how countries can unlock investment to accelerate industry transformation, which has become an imperative to enhance the competitiveness and resilience of our economy. Industry is a cornerstone for economic growth, job creation, and innovation, so its transformation is critical for long-term economic resilience and competitiveness at the same time, with industry emissions at the same time accounting for some 40% of global energy-related carbon dioxide emissions. This transformation is critical, depending on the availability and also affordability and reliable energy and effective emission reduction technologies to come. So the good news is that technology for emission reductions are increasingly becoming available. Industrial electrification powered by renewables, clean hydrogen, carbon capture, and improvements in material efficiency offer significant emission reduction potentials. But many of these technologies still face higher costs, elevated risks, and uncertain revenue prospects compared to conventional production routes. So as a result, investment and finance are not yet flowing at the scale or speed that's necessary. And this raises some fundamental questions for policymakers, financiers, and industry alike. So we will be addressing during this webinar questions like, what practical actions are needed to accelerate industrial transformation? What can public policy and domestic and international public finance use to be used more effectively to unlock private investment? And also, what lessons can be drawn from countries that are already navigating these challenges on the ground? In today's Green Talk Live, the material that will be presented and discussed will draw on the OECD's framework for industry's net zero transition, which provides a structured, practical, and applicable approach for identifying both barriers and opportunity to strengthen enabling conditions to mobilize finance for industry transformation. And informed by evidence from recent country implementation of this framework in Egypt, Indonesia, South Africa, and Thailand, our panelists today will provide insights from various industrial sectors and explore how these lessons can inform broader policy and financing strategies across OECD countries, but also countries in emerging markets. We will start off with first a presentation by our OECD Environment Directorate colleague, Cécile Séguinon. She is Industry Policy Analyst in the OECD Environment Directorate. And then after that, we'll be followed by three distinguished speakers, and there'll be discussants. First, from South Africa, she's Janita Badul. She's a Senior Policy Advisor for Sustainable Program and Projects at Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment of the Government of South Africa. Second discussant will be Teresa Schoppel. She is Scientific Advisor for Industry Decarbonization in the German Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy. And our third discussant will be Sabrina Saenz, and she's from the UK government. She's the head of International Industrial Decarbonization at Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. So very warm welcome to all three panelists today. And after all of their intervention, we'll open the floor so you can join us in the conversation. And throughout the entire duration of the webinar, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen in Zoom, and we'll try to take as many questions as possible in the latter part of the program where we open the floor. So without further ado, I want to pass the floor to Cécile, who will now present the key findings from the implementation of the OECD framework for industry's net zero transition in several countries. And with that, over to you, Cécile.
Thank you very much, Kumi, for the introduction, and good morning, good afternoon to all participants. Very pleased indeed to share these findings. So I will now share my screen. Okay. And I think that you can see. Please let me know if you're okay. Okay. So we've already heard in the opening remark that industry transformation provide benefit that can go beyond emission reduction. It's also about contributing to other environmental goals, supporting economic aspect, wider socio-economic aspect, innovation, and so on. So I won't go into the detail, but at the same time, indeed, face multiple barriers, and multiple barriers remain. A massive investment are needed, and I'd like to recall that in our recent OECD IEA report on support for decarbonizing heavy industry, the global investment needs over the next decade for near zero emission in the cement and steel sector together would need indeed to reach 500 billion USD to be aligned with the net zero pathway. So investment is a big challenge, but it's not the only one. Production costs remain higher. Some low carbon technology are not fully commercially mature. Demand for green industrial product is still limited. And these challenges are often reinforced by gaps in infrastructure or policy framework and coordination. So this is why mobilizing finance and putting the right policy framework in place is essential. And this is precisely where our work on industry transformation comes in. So at the OECD Environment Directorate, we have developed a comprehensive program on finance and investment for industry transformation over the past 4 years. It started with the OECD framework for industry net zero transition, as mentioned, and we now cover a full set of policy reports, knowledge products, and compendium of case studies on industrial project and financing instrument. And beyond this policy advice and expertise, we also act as a convener, bringing together government, industry, and financial stakeholders through dialogues, peer learning, and capacity building workshops. And some of these reports and activities are mentioned here, but you can find all of them on the OECD website. So turning to the framework, the core question is how to mobilize finance and investment for industry transformation, and in particular, how to close the competitiveness gap between low carbon and conventional industrial production routes. Competitiveness indeed is a key concern that has been raised by government and industry stakeholders in all the countries and in all the sectors where we have implemented the framework. And so this is why the objective through the implementation of the framework is really to provide recommendation on the economic financing instrument and the enabling investment conditions that are needed to make these low carbon production routes more competitive. So what do we cover? Until now, we have applied the framework on different sectors, as you can see here, on iron and steel, petrochemicals and plastics, clean hydrogen for industrial uses, textiles with a focus on industrial heat. But to provide actionable recommendation, we need to go beyond the sector level and we need to look at the technology level. Because decarbonizing a sector through hydrogen or through carbon capture or fuel switching or electrification requires very different policy approaches. So for that purpose, we focus on each sector on specific low carbon technologies that you can see here. And when we look at this overall picture, what we cover is in the end relevant to any country aiming to transform its industry. It's about breakthrough technologies, electrification, fuel switching, or energy efficiency. In terms of implementation in countries, so our latest country reports were on South Africa, iron and steel, Thailand, petrochemicals and plastics. The Egypt country report on clean hydrogen will be released next week. And for Indonesia, the report on iron and steel and textile will follow later this year. So stay tuned. And in the next slide, I will use the findings from the 2 reports that has been released, so South Africa and Thailand, to illustrate which type of outcomes the framework can provide and how this can support policymakers. And I will also share some cross-cutting insights that can be drawn from the framework implementation across all countries, all sectors, and all technologies. So, as I mentioned earlier, competitiveness is a key challenge. And to develop concrete recommendations for one specific sector and low carbon technology, we need first to quantify this competitiveness gap. And we do this through techno-economic assessment. For instance, in South Africa, iron and steel, we estimate that producing 1 ton of steel using low emission routes, such as carbon capture or hydrogen, costs around 25 to 40% more than conventional coal-based production. You can find more details and sensitivity analysis on this cost assessment in the report. But just to highlight that assessing this competitiveness gap is our starting point to test economic and financing instruments and to assess how these instruments can reduce or even close this gap. And for that, I would like to provide another illustration, another example from Thailand's petrochemicals and plastic value chain, where we looked at 2 bio-based plastic options, option 1 and 2, and they are significantly more expensive to produce compared to the conventional fossil fuel-based plastics. And we looked also at the third option using carbon capture, which increases production cost by around 20%. And the results show that the most effective instruments differ significantly by option. For CCS, as you can see, for instance, the key instruments were carbon pricing, carbon contract for difference, and green premiums. For bio-based and biodegradable plastics, the instruments were different. This was about plastic pollution fee, green premiums, or concessional loans. And for the option 1, which focused on a specific bio-based plastic, these were targeted measures on the price of bio-based inputs that were the most effective. So very different instruments depending on the options. And this brings me to a key cross-cutting findings across countries and sectors, the fact that the most effective instruments differ by low carbon option. So here, what I will illustrate is that for each low carbon option, so let's take the example of what I just mentioned, option 1, 2, 3, we use our techno-economic model and we test a wide range of economic and financing instruments. For instance, concessional loans, grants, carbon pricing, energy or feedstock subsidies, de-risking instruments that will lower the cost of capital. So very different instruments. And we assess the impact of each instrument on the competitiveness gap. And what we see is that for one specific low carbon option, so let's take the example of CCS here, you see different colors in the column, meaning that the instruments do not have the same potential to close the competitiveness gap. And conversely, one instrument may be impactful for one option, but not for another. And these are really critical outcomes for policymakers because having a list of levels of instruments can be a first step, but it does not tell you which instruments are the most impactful and thus which ones should be prioritized. And even worse, that means that public support could be also misdirected towards instruments or levels that are not impactful. So these are critical considerations, in particular as we are moving towards implementation, to be sure that we develop and implement the right instrument for each sector and each option. Another key finding across countries, sectors, and technology is that a combination of instruments is needed to close the competitiveness gap. And on instruments more specifically, we can also draw some cross-cutting insights. First, that the support and de-risking instruments for investment, so for instance, CapEx grant, tax rebate, concessional loans, or guarantees, these are useful instruments, but they are not sufficient to close the gap. They have a limited impact compared to other instruments. Second, that the revenue stabilization mechanisms, for instance, green premium or contract for difference, are very important to improve the business case. Third, that instruments that acting on the operating cost are very crucial. This can be price cap or support for energy subsidies, feedstock, removing fossil fuel subsidies too. And fourth, that mechanism that give a value to CO2 emission, for instance, carbon pricing or carbon credit, are really key to close the gap. So you can see on the right an illustrative chart showing an example of here hydrogen-based steel production that combines these 4 types of categories of instruments to close the gap. So I just share several cross-cutting insights, and this one is another important one. The fact that financial instruments are necessary, but not sufficient to unlock investment. You may have, let's take the example, a project may be viable with financing instrument in place, economically viable, but without the right infrastructure or without the right regulation or coordination, it may simply not happen. And so this is why building the enabling conditions are also very critical in addition to financing instrument and economic tools. Across all the countries, sector and technology, we can identify a consistent set of these enabling conditions that are critical. So they include first, clear strategic signaling with long-term vision, target and sectoral roadmap, supportive regulatory frameworks, whether it's on CCS, hydrogen, low carbon electricity, sustainable taxonomies to ensure that investment are directed toward low carbon technologies. Availability and affordability of strategic inputs are essential for industrial production, so energy and feedstock. Enabling infrastructure, of course, is critical, whether, again, for carbon capture, hydrogen, or low carbon electricity. It's about pipeline storage and grids. Demand-side measure, such as public procurement, green public procurement, minimum content requirement or mandate. And overarching all of these, there are also strong governance and coordination across ministries, as well as international cooperation. So each country report details what these categories cover, with enabling conditions that are really tailored to the specific sectors and technology selected, because again, each one of these categories is specific to the sector or the technology that you are looking at. So based on these outcomes on financing instrument and enabling condition, we develop a set of policy recommendations. So these recommendations, they cover multiple dimensions, including policy framework, financing, infrastructure, market design. And for each recommendation, the lead institutions and indicative timelines are also identified. Here I illustrate this using the South Africa example of iron and steel. It's not to go through each recommendation, but just to show how the previous outcomes can, in the end, be combined into a country roadmap. And we do this for each country. And very important is that the recommendations are implementation-oriented. They support policy development. So in South Africa, these are input to the national steel roadmap preparation. In Thailand, the recommendation will be submitted to the National Committee on Industry Development. And in Egypt, the recommendations support the operationalization of the National Low Carbon Hydrogen Strategy. I'd like now to wrap up with a summary of 6 key learnings from the framework implementation, again, across countries, sectors, and technologies. So to wrap up, so first, we saw that multiple instruments can reduce the competitiveness gap, but their impact highly vary across low carbon options and industrial subsector, which means that a tailored approach is required with instruments carefully selected and prioritized to maximize effectiveness. Second, that bridging the competitiveness gap requires a combination of instruments, and key instruments across sector and option that we have identified include carbon pricing, revenue stabilization mechanisms, OPEX support for low carbon inputs, the removal of environmentally harmful subsidies and demand-side measures. Third, that de-risking approaches are needed to support a first-of-a-kind project, which include targeted and time-bound public support, as well as risk-sharing mechanism, risk-sharing through multi-stakeholder approach to crowding private investment. Fourth, that the enabling conditions are critical for investment, and that investment decisions need also policy clarity, predictability, including clear taxonomies, demand-side policies, and coherent regulatory framework. 5, that a full value chain perspective is essential. Policy design should also address feedstock, infrastructure, and system integration, and not only the industrial production assets. And finally, that industry transformation relies on close coordination, strengthened coordination, and cooperation, especially enhance cross-ministerial coordination at the national level, as we see in our different recommendation for all the countries that in the end cover many different ministries and national agencies. So cross-coordination is really key. And finally, international cooperation is essentially crucial to support the scale-up of industry, technology, and overall transformation. So these are some key findings of our recent work. I invite you, of course, to go through the report if you want more specific insight on a specific sector. But I think we'll also have the opportunity to discuss this in the discussion and Q&A session. So with that, thank you very much. And I will stop here with the scene setting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cecile. A lot of key insights that we'll go and dig deeper right now in our panel discussion. So thank you. Now, I would like to turn now to Janita Badu from South Africa. And welcome again, Janita. So your government of South Africa and the OECD have been closely collaborating, as we heard in Cecile's presentation, that give a bit of a spotlight on that. In implementing, how to implement this OECD framework for industry net zero transition and developing financing solutions, specifically for your country's iron and steel sector. And we understand from our team here that your Ministry Department of Trade, Industry and Competition also worked with National Treasury. And then this collaboration has been very critical in developing this set of recommendation and roadmap for your country. And it was launched, the report was launched successfully last October in the margin of G20 ministerial during your country's presidency. So based on this successful collaboration, I'd like to invite you to share a little bit more on South Africa's experience throughout this implementation phase of this framework, and how the recommendation from this report, OECD report, supported the progress in the transforming your country's iron and steel sector and developing related policies in South Africa. So please, over to you, Janita.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kumi, for that introduction. Good morning to my fellow panelists, Teresa and Sabrina, and to Cecile as well, who initiated the journey through the SEFM program. So thank you for that. I would want to maybe indicate that in terms of collaboration across ministries, this has been one of the success elements for the SEFM program and the looking at the decarbonization of the steel sector for South Africa. We were split between whether we focus on the cement sector, which is also a hard-to-abate sector, or the steel sector. But nonetheless, the learnings coming out of the steel sector will definitely, enable further work that needs to be undertaken around the cement sector. But I think in terms of collaboration and how it's brought us to this point, the governance structures that we put in place during embarking on this process itself, we had a task team in place. We had a project steering committee, which met on a quarterly basis. And to actually top it up, we also had a technical advisory committee in place. And this included the broader stakeholder base from the private sector as well as industry association. And then we also identified an industry partner that actually brought the realism to the entire program itself and the project for the decarbonization of the steel sector, because listening to some of the challenges which the sector was experiencing through the industry partner itself was, enabling the process and ensuring that what we were putting in place would actually be meaningful at the end of the day. So, in terms of the work that was undertaken, this back and forth collaboration with the different stakeholders actually helped to strengthen it, and having the participation of the National Treasury as well as the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition through a collaborative effort across government actually enabled this process further. I think the intention here is not necessarily to alienate the ministries on the work that was being undertaken, but actually to strengthen further collaboration on other programs that may happen in the future as well. For the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, we found it as an opportunity to also advance the Climate Change Act imperatives, especially around mitigation and more specifically around the hard-to-abate sectors. So it has actually brought us to a point where the collaborative effort, the ongoing discussions with industry partners as well as the association has brought us to a point. Cecile did reflect on the priority recommendations that the report put forward. And going forward now, the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition is definitely taking this process forward. They have established another PSC, an interim PSC that will provide oversight on the development of this roadmap action plan to move it forward. But in parallel, we've also been engaging with the United Nations Industry Development Organization. And the intention here was to pick up on some of the recommendations and see how we could actually advance it. So the Industrial Development Corporation is definitely one of the key stakeholders for this particular initiative as well. But we continue to work with the OECD on this because of its ability to actually convene. We've also indicated that we would be keen to explore other opportunities with like-minded countries who find themselves in a similar situation in transitioning hard-to-abate sectors. But over and above that, the countries, the partner countries or the donor partner countries who've actually made this possible in terms of providing the necessary financial support to get this program going. I think they need to be commended in that regard. Because with emerging emerging countries, the challenge here is for the private sector in actually mobilizing finances that could assist in R&D, uptake of technology, the ability to unlock finances, as Cecile has indicated in her presentation. And then how do we determine which technology, these private sector partners could actually pursue in the medium to long term? This is definitely a journey. We are finding ourselves right in the middle at the moment in terms of the country report being put in place and other planning instruments that need to be put in place. And how do we actually use, for example, the Carbon Tax Act and the allowances that have been provided, but in the medium to long term, with setting of carbon budgets, how do we, move the hard-to-abate sectors in the country forward? Let me stop there, Ms. Kumi, and then we can continue the discussion on other areas as well. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Janita, and especially highlighting this cross-ministerial collaboration, the industry and competitiveness environment, and also treasury, and also together with the industry. It's been very critical. And also, thank you for commenting that this OECD work has been helpful, and also as a OECD's convenient role and within the country, but similar experiences and lessons learned with other countries. So now it's a nice segue to now turn to other panelists who are with us today. So now let me ask this one same question to all of you, all three panelists, to explore different national contexts in shaping industry decarbonization. So could all three of you each outline how your country is driving decarbonization in the industry sector, including key policy frameworks and instruments that you're using in your country? Now, let's turn to Teresa to start by sharing some experience from Germany. And then after that, we'd like to turn to Sabrina from the UK perspective. And then we come back to Janita on this particular question. So over to you first to Teresa.
Thank you so much, Kumi. Thank you so much again also for having me today. It's a real pleasure for me to be on this panel. It's a tough question. I'm also excited to hear what my fellow panelists will say. I'll try and spin it this way. Germany is at, I would say, the center of a dilemma of competitiveness versus decarbonization, right? What makes the situation special in Germany, I would say, is that the decarbonization goals are very ambitious, but the policies are also well funded. So it's a complex situation, it's an evolving situation, and I would say the three main simultaneous pressures that Germany has to deal with right now is especially high electricity prices compared to global competitors, for sure. As I said, the deep decarbonization requirements that we need to figure out toward climate neutrality. There is a certain investment uncertainty. So I think it's a problem globally, but investments need to be based on uncertain hydrogen availability, on not really existing CCS infrastructure yet. There is a grid infrastructure that is not, it's just evolving. So we as Cecile also said in her introductory talk, there is demand risk for green products. So it's a evolving and dynamic situation market side, and electricity prices are a challenge in Germany, and decarbonization requirements are very real. So there are a bunch of policies in place already in Germany that should alleviate and that should help industrial decisions. And it is really about not just decarbonizing, but just avoiding deindustrialization really during the transition time in Germany. So we have a bunch of big levers in place. The IPCEIs that you may be familiar with at EU level, right? Large scale cross-border projects that can really change the situation for heavy industry. Then in Germany, we have an instrument called BIC, which is federal funding for industry and climate protection, which is quite flexible. It's a little smaller, but it does also support efficiency initiatives and fuel switching, electrifications. And then there are the CCFDs, the carbon contracts for difference, that are in place in Germany, that are meant to tackle the cost gap head on between the conventional and the low carbon production. And they go long term, they're 15-year contracts, and they're for big, as Cecile also has shown in her slides, first of a kind projects. This is what the CCFDs are meant to also fuel and enable. So we have quite a complexity in the challenges that we face. We have a certain regulatory uncertainty. I always say a certain uncertainty, but there is a regulatory uncertainty still in Germany that is a big challenge for investment decisions across energy intense sectors. So we need investment support, we need risk sharing, and we need at least a temporary relief. And then the big challenges going forward doing this is in reality the execution of all this. So the willingness is there, ambitions are there, but now we need to have practical instruments to really get things off the ground.
Thanks a lot. Yes, and especially now, the high energy prices, electricity prices in particular, when we're talking about ambitious electrification, it's very, very pertinent, especially right now, I would say. And thanks for your example of contract for carbon contract for difference, specifically in the context of Germany. Thank you. Let's now turn to the UK's experience. Now I want to give the floor over to Sabrina.
Hello, yeah, and thank you for having me join the session today. From a UK perspective, similar to Germany, we start with a clear premise that decarbonisation must go hand in hand with competitiveness. So industry is central to our economy, supporting around 5 million jobs across the value chain. And at the same time, it accounts for roughly 17% of UK territorial emissions. So if we are to meet our climate goals credibly, industry has to be in the centre of that transition. So our objective is therefore to enable a competitive low carbon future for UK industry that requires a policy mix that is credible for investors, grounded in real world delivery, and aligned with how industrial investment decisions are actually made. So the UK's approach to industry decarbonisation is grounded in independent evidence and a clear assessment of where emissions reductions can be delivered most effectively. So advice from the UK's government's independent climate advisor, the Climate Change Committee, set out expectations for industrial decarbonisation through its balanced pathway from 2025 to 2050. And this shows that a range of measures will be required, with industrial electrification as the single biggest contributor. And under this pathway, electricity is expected to meet around 61% of industrial energy demand, up from roughly 26% today. So on that basis, the UK is prioritising industrial electrification as a technology to decarbonise and also encourage growth and resilience. So the evidence shows it can deliver substantial emissions reductions while strengthening long-term resilience. To enable this transition, our policies focus on creating economic frameworks that work in practice, addressing market failures, tackling infrastructure and price barriers, and supporting technology deployment in ways that align decarbonisation with competitiveness. And the core of this approach is recognition that different sectors and regions face different challenges and will not transition in the same way or at the same pace. Therefore, the policies that we bring in need to be targeted, flexible, and grounded in delivery. So electrification in industry provides a clear illustration of how this approach translates into policy design. Our latest modelling shows that electrification delivers the largest share of industrial emissions reductions can do over the next 2 decades in the UK. So it's often the most efficient and scalable option, and can significantly reduce exposure to future fossil fuel price rises and shocks. However, similar to what others have said, we've faced high electricity costs relative to gas, which has made fuel switching uneconomic, even when it's technically viable. So we have therefore paired our ambition with reform, taking concrete actions to reduce electricity costs in industry. So from April 2026, we're increasing the discount on electricity network charges for the most energy intensive firms from 60% up to 90%. From 2027, the British Industrial Competitiveness Scheme will reduce electricity costs up by £40 per megawatt hour over 7,000 electricity intensive businesses in sectors like automotive, aerospace, and chemicals. And alongside our immediate actions to cut bills, we're also looking ahead. So we're consulting on further reforms to reduce the price of electricity relative to gas, so businesses can benefit more fully from cheaper, clean, homegrown power. So for industry, this is fundamentally about correcting price signals so that efficient, low carbon investment decisions can stack up. And at the same time, trying to reform grid connections and planning processes, including through a connections accelerator to ensure viable industrial projects can connect the systems and proceed at pace. But it's also worth noting that electrification will not be the only solution for industrial processes. In sectors such as cement, chemicals, refining, CCUS will remain essential. So the UK is also backing CCUS with £9.4 billion worth of public funding, and the model is explicitly sector and place-based, supporting industrial clusters, multiple emitters, share transport and storage links in an infrastructure in these clusters, which reduces costs, lowers risk, and allows governments to take on long-time liabilities that markets cannot yet efficiently price. And also hydrogen as well. So hydrogen plays a more targeted role, focusing on processes that are more challenging to electrify, such as chemicals, heavy clay, cement, and flat glass. And the UK has committed over £500 million to develop the UK's first regional hydrogen network, connecting production, transport, and storage with end users for the first time. And we put in place business models and standards to ensure government supported hydrogen delivers real emissions reductions. So just to close, worth noting that the UK will bring forward a national plan for industrial decarbonisation, setting out strategic approaches to working with industry. And we believe that industrial decarbonisation is not only essential for climate change, but also a growth opportunity, and international cooperation is critical to making this transition faster, fairer, and more investable. And that is the approach the UK has taken, and keen to continue sharing and refining through and with partners within the OECD. Thanks.
Thank you so much for also mentioning this national plan for industry decarbonization, but also touching on specific policy instruments like right now the discount on electricity tariff for heavy industry users, but also you mentioned the need for them to connect to the grids, but public R&D for CCUS. I mean, all these specific different policy tools that will constitute the wider national strategy. So thank you for that. Now let's come back to Janita for South Africa. If you could mention a little bit along this line on policy instruments.
Thank you for that, Kumi. So I think it's a myriad of different, measures that need to be put in place, and obviously creating that enabling environment with different policy instruments, as you've mentioned. I think I alluded to one or two in my introductory remarks, and that included, the Carbon Tax Act as well, which was officially promulgated in 2019. And we're currently in a space where we've been exploring and actually implementing allowances across the different sectors, including the hard-to-abate sectors. But once the carbon budgets have been finalized, then, some of these allowances will definitely not necessarily be applicable. And the pricing has to be affordable as well for industry, because one of the unintended consequences would be that you have industry prematurely actually closing their doors, and we can't afford to let something like that happen, because it definitely puts people out of their jobs as well if we have such a situation arising. Now, in terms of the energy transition, and just picking up on the point that Sabrina made, South Africa is obviously transitioning its energy system. We currently sitting at about approximately 74%, which is coal-fired generation. But in terms of the installed capacity of renewables, it's definitely on the increase. We started the Renewable Energy Program way back in 2011. And the Just Energy Transition Partnership has definitely provided momentum in that regard. But it's quite a few of the different measures that are being put in place at a municipal level, as well as with regard to the utility. We've had the decommissioning of one of our power plants, but it obviously then requires for taking into consideration the socioeconomic conditions that may actually arise as a result of something like that. Now, in terms of the hard-to-abate sectors, and as we've been talking about the steel sector, what we've found is that industry requires for the necessary support to be put in place. And I think I want to maybe just allude to briefly on import taxes and how does it actually impact the market, because we have certain countries that actually provide subsidies that are of quite a high nature, and it impacts on the import of cheap steel, obviously skewing the domestic market in that regard. And this is one of the challenges that the domestic steelmakers have been experiencing for some time. So reflecting on that and seeing what type of levers could be put in place to ensure that we are able to actually balance this and not necessarily take on a protectionist perspective, but also protect the domestic market in that regard. A second one is, and this is something that we also highlighted in the recommendations, it was on actually creating the demand for green steel. So we have to look at the opportunity both for export purposes as well as domestic uptake. But many of I think in terms of the uptake, it requires marketing, requires to secure some offtake agreements that are put in place. And this will actually spur on the steel sector to actually produce the green steel to decarbonize, because you have that security in terms of your offtake. And as the demand increases, it incentivizes industry to move in that direction in terms of their decarbonization and transitioning their industry. Now, I think in terms of finances, Cecile also mentioned this as being one of the areas, access to affordable financing and the ability for industry itself to service debt and not necessarily finding itself in a situation where taking on debt to ensure that you have energy efficient technology then becomes a challenge whilst you're producing green steel, for example, but you're unable to actually meet the potential to service the debt at the end of the day. So this is in itself becomes a huge challenge. And then I did mention earlier on in terms of the research and development imperatives that are required by industry itself and the support that can be provided at the domestic level as well as from international best practices. And I think my final point is around the issue of skills and capacity. So in order to transition industry as well, we need that type of human resources that are adequately skilled, both for industry as well as within the public sector, because we are supposed to be assisting industry. We should equally be capacitated to do that. So there's, as I mentioned at the beginning, it is a myriad of different measures and levers that need to be put in place to actually assist industry in the short term and to see this transition taking place in the medium to long term.
Thank you. Thank you for these very specific examples further from your country, South Africa. Let us now turn to Sabrina, because I understand Sabrina has a hard stop and time constraint. So let's go to her now. So we've heard several different examples of domestic policy instruments and how they're being used in specific country and sectoral context. Let's turn now to the more international dimension. So Sabrina, how can international collaboration help to accelerate industry decarbonization and unlock the investment needed to deliver it at scale, at the more a global level?
Thank you. Yeah, from the UK point of view, we see international collaboration as essential because industrial decarbonisation is capital intensive, it's cross-border, high risk, particularly in emerging markets, and no single country or institution could solve these challenges alone. So today, the problem, as we've heard, is not the lack of ambition, it's about the fragmentation. So finance is spread across multiple initiatives, instruments, institutions, making it hard for countries and investors to navigate. So that international collaboration helps to reduce the fragmentation, align concessional and public finance, and use it strategically to also crowd in private finance. So through initiatives such as the Global South Green Industrialization Finance Working Group, international collaboration can accelerate progress and unlock investments in practical ways. So some context on the working group, it is an international coordination mechanism that was set up last year to help mobilize and better coordinate finance and investment for industrial decarbonisation in emerging markets and developing economies. So it tries to accelerate decarbonisation and unlock investment. So the working group launched a joint statement and roadmap on green industrialisation international assistance at COP30, marking a shift from pledges to implementation with a clear focus on country-led industrial pipelines. And part of this, it was recognised that country platforms can make a real difference. So the working group also launched the Industrial Decarbonisation Country Hubs Accelerator Programme, which is jointly funded by the UK, Germany, and the Global Industry Hub. So international partners will support governments to bring together different line ministries in their country, industry, MDBs, and investors around a single national industrial transition plan, attempting to turn ambition into pipelines, and then those pipelines into bankable projects. It also supports the use of smarter public and concessional finance to reduce first-of-a-kind risks, improve bankability, and unlock larger volumes of private finance, particularly in hard-to-abate industrial sectors. The group as a whole ensures that Global South leadership is at the centre. So the group is co-led by Brazil, Turkey, the UK, and Germany, improving credibility and investor confidence by aligning international support with country priorities. And the model of collaboration matters going forward. So the working group is anchored as a finance delivery arm under the Global Green Industrialization Agenda, which was launched as the Blend Declaration on Green Industrialization at COP30, and also supports Pillar 3 of the Climate Club. So the group shows how international collaboration can move from high-level ambitions to practical delivery at scale without duplicating efforts. So to kind of finish, the international collaboration accelerates industrial decarbonisation by trying to align finance, de-risking projects, and building credible pipelines. And the Global South Green Industrialisation Finance Working Group demonstrates this in a country-led coordinating way, which is key to unlocking the scale of finance needed. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sabrina. So for some of the examples of how, in the international cooperation context, public finance can be used to leverage private capital to make some of these projects to come into fruition. So thank you for that. Now going back from cross-border international back to the more domestic and policy approach experience. Let me turn back now to the Germany's case where actually Teresa mentioned already a little bit in her earlier intervention about the carbon contracts for difference. Let us kind of zoom in on that if you can, and how Germany's been pioneering such an approach. And you can explain to us a little bit more how this works in practice.
Thank you, Kumi. Yes, I'd be happy to. The CCFDs are a quite complex instrument, but I think it's a very timely one, and it can actually have a lot of effect and efficiency in a very dynamic market situation, as we've heard a lot about today. So we know that the core issue of heavy industry is that the clean production is just significantly more expensive than conventional production. We've heard about green steel produced with hydrogen. We all know low carbon cement using CCS, beautiful products, but the production is just more expensive, and the business case oftentimes is just not there. So in reality, even in the EU with the EU ETS, the carbon prices are not high or stable enough to close that gap. And I would say this is where you have to imagine the CCFDs to come in as an instrument adjacent to the EU ETS. It directly tackles that cost gap. So the carbon markets, they provide long-term signals, and the CCFDs, they provide short-term certainty. A carbon contract for difference is actually in essence, I would say, public risk sharing contract. It's a two-sided contract about alleviating the risk from just a company that wants to invest in a green production. What the government does is we guarantee a fixed carbon cost level, or say an abatement cost over time. And the time is 15 years. So there is a lot of guarantee in the investment over a foreseeable period of time. So it's focused on the hard to abate sectors, on heavy industry. And as we've heard today, some optimizations or efficiency increases are important, but oftentimes they're not enough for these real big production sites that are in the EU ETS1. And this is where the CCFDs are mostly focused on, with big projects that need a lot of investment, which comes, of course, with a lot of risk. So we're looking at these big investments with significant help, with big funding sums. We allocate these funding sums in the CCFDs in a competitive auction, which makes them particularly interesting for us and efficient for a government to use as a funding scheme. What is also, I would say, another positive aspect of this bidding is that we do not have to look into the bids in detail. So the companies decide themselves, they produce their bids, and they price everything in: capex, opex, uncertainties. So however they want to place their bid is where they're allowed to, of course, in a competitive auction. And then the winner in the auction that produces the best bid gets a 15-year contract for their cost difference, the cost gaps. So I would say there are a lot of challenges with doing a carbon contract for difference. As I mentioned, these contracts are meant to cover big investments, first of a kind investments in hard to abate sectors. So we're definitely talking billions in public funding. So the fiscal burden on the country is, I would say, quite high. And you also have to commit to these contracts for, in our case, 15 years. But definitely a contract like that would not work if it were only for 2-3 years, because that's how long it takes for the plans to come into operation, right? So you have to provide this reassurance for, say, decades. CCFDs also don't solve everything. We've heard a lot about green markets now. It's a very important aspect in the ecosystem that has to be coordinated. The CCFDs solve only, in quotation marks, the supply side, right? So it has to be aligned with markets. There has to be a demand creation that the CCFDs don't necessarily solve. Such contracts have to be in alignment with infrastructure, and they have to be complementary policies, like I mentioned initially in my introductory words, that energy prices is something that also needs to be aligned with these funding policy schemes. And I'm also happy to go into more detail in the Q&A on the CCFDs. It's obviously something close to heart. We wish to launch the next auction actually next week, so I'm excited about the next round and see how it goes.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Teresa. Yeah, obviously there's a lot of interest. You gave all the caveats, like it's not a silver bullet, that's a supply side solution, one of many solutions, but it can only be implementable with governments with deep pockets, etc. It's a long-term, big cost proposition. And of course, demand side has to be dealt with in other demand creation, market creation, demand creation type of tools as well. So everything again in a policy package in a nutshell. But yes, clearly a big interest in that. Now let us turn with the remain. We still have about 10 minutes left or so. Let's turn to some questions that came from participants, so we can enlarge our conversation. I'm reading out from what I can see from the team, what came in. So there's a question from Abdikani Ahmed, he's from Somalia. And his question is, what practical strategies and policy mechanisms would you recommend for fragile and developing countries like Somalia to attract green investment, strengthen renewable energy infrastructure, and promote sustainable industrial growth despite governance and financing challenges? So maybe a question. This question might be for Janita from the fellow continent. And maybe if, I don't know, I think Sabrina, because she talked about international cooperation, but I think she has to, I think you have a hard spot. So, but thank you, Sabrina. I know you have to go. Thank you very much for your contribution from the UK perspective and also the international cooperation perspective. But going back to this question from Mr. Ahmed, Janita, maybe you have some advice or guidance, insights.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for that question. I think from our experience, it's been quite a long journey from a policy perspective. We started with a voluntary process on our Carbon Tax Act way back in 2014. Took several dialogues and consultations with the private sector to see what would be possible. We embarked on this process of voluntary offsets as well. So it's been a long time in the making. And I think for countries who are embarking on this journey, you have to have the private sector on your side. You have to provide them or make the case for why the transition is required and what is the type of support that's going to come through. A top-down approach wherein there is no conversation, there is no consultation, is just going to make it more difficult. And you probably have industry sitting on opposite ends with the public sector and making that challenge even greater to actually create this enabling policy environment for the private sector to transition. Over and above that, as I think Sabrina mentioned in terms of Teresa mentioned actually, in terms of the having deep pockets to finance the transition, that becomes a challenge. We have quite a constrained fiscal environment currently, and it's obviously requiring for partnerships to be established. We require that international best practice as well as finances to flow through to bring about the transition that we'd like to see in the medium to long term as we transition to a point where we can achieve our net zero 2050 targets as well. So it is in terms of the renewable energy program that we embarked on. This has been an enabler for us, but it's not necessarily taken us to the point where we'd like to see ourselves. It's still a journey that we are still embarking on. And then the capacity that's required, as I mentioned, when I provided my input on the earlier points. I think for Somalia, you have to also prepare your skills, your skill sets and your workforce. So you need academia to be on board to actually provide you with that assistance. I'll stop there. Thanks, Kumi.
Thank you so much. Just in, we have a few technology-specific questions in the Q&A. But maybe let's see. I'll just throw it out in case anybody wants to take it, but maybe it may not be fully aligned with the discussion. But as carbon pricing becomes a key element of industry decarbonization in the EU, how do we avoid a situation where emerging and developing economies with weaker or inexistent carbon markets are left behind? It's more like the policy stringency different across different jurisdiction type of question. Does anybody want to take that? Now we have very few minutes left if somebody has a very quick answer to that. Volunteers?
Maybe I can start and throw in the word
Yeah, go ahead.
CBAM.
Yeah, please,
Maybe
please,
Sunita
Sabrina.
can then
Teresa,
add
go
to
ahead.
that. This is a very good question, and it's something that is definitely front and center on our minds and on the industry that is faced with high carbon prices. I mean, we with the funding, we wish to make that burden a little bit less heavy, but it still exists, and it is in the international markets. It's still a disadvantage, that's for sure. So there are systems put in place like the CBAM who try to level the playing field a little bit more. It's an imperfect system, but I think it's a step in the right direction. And we just need these cross-border global systems for our push toward net zero to work in reality.
Yeah, Kumi, if I can come in on this as well.
Yes,
I mean, in
please.
terms of the carbon pricing, as I mentioned earlier on, we embarked on this process of creating allowances and putting it in place for industry to actually adjust to what is required in the medium to long term. The allowances still continue, and in terms of the carbon pricing as well, it's been a consultative process with the private sector to ensure that they can actually to manage within their operations to service it, because even though it is the responsible thing to do from industry side, they are still adjusting to it. So I think you have to ease that burden together with actually reaching a point where you know that industry has now adapted and adopted this transition fully to avoid premature closure, as I mentioned earlier on, to avoid job losses. This is definitely a critical aspect for South Africa itself, and then the absorption of new employees who could actually enter the sector as you introduce more energy efficient technology, and you see this trend on the rise as well. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Overall, it really rings true that it's a lot of balancing act, industry decarbonization journey, different stakeholders, and even domestically, as Janita mentioned, but also cross-border of different countries' context, different national policies and stringency, etc. So thank you for that. I think we just have a few more minutes. I just want to just turn to Cecile if she wants to just highlight a few things to wrap up, going back to some of the learning that she presented at the beginning in a couple of minutes. If she could do it very briefly.
Thank you very much. Actually, maybe I would like to add a few words on one thing that we have not discussed during the question. It's about the need to ensure that we consider a full value chain approach. And for that, I would just like to give a concrete example of one report, so the Thailand Petrochemicals and Plastic, because it provides neat recommendation from the upstream to downstream of the value chain. And I just want to give an example to show why this is so important to cover the value chain with this example. In that case, for petrochemicals in plastic, this is a relevant example because it showed the importance of ensuring alignment between decarbonization choices and policy for petrochemicals on the one hand, but also with policy that aim to reduce plastic pollution on the other hand. And so it means that in practice, the policy choices for reducing plastic pollution may directly influence the choice and the design of some of the recommendations that we propose for decarbonizing the petrochemical sector. For instance, important to clarify which type of plastic can support both environmental goals. So this just to highlight the importance of when focusing on one industry sector, to focus on the full value chain, because you may need in the end to have some synergies and trade-off between different type of environmental goal or policies that you cannot treat in silo, and you need to treat it in a comprehensive way to ensure that your decarbonization policies are also efficient. And I stop here.
Thank you, Cecile, for bringing up this important value chain wide perspective to our conversation today, which unfortunately we have to come to a wrap-up time. Today we extended by 10 minutes or so, longer than our usual Green Talk. But I would like to give a warm round of thanks to all the speakers today. We had Janita Badul from South Africa. We had Teresa Schappel from Germany and Sabrina Size from the UK, who shared with these ladies. It was an all-female panel. Great. So we all ladies shared our perspectives from different experiences and countries. Just maybe if I have just 1 minute to wrap up, I'm just pleased to announce that the OECD's country report on implementing this framework for industry decarbonization transition that we've been talking about, to be published this year on May 4th, we will release our report from our Egypt country implementation that explores financing solutions for accelerating clean hydrogen projects for domestic industry use and for exports. And also country report on decarbonizing iron, steel, and textile sector in Indonesia will be released in the last quarter of this year. So please stay tuned. And you can find out more about our framework implementation and OECD work on industrial transformation financing by visiting our dedicated webpage, which I think has been shared on the chat. And again, thanks for all the participants online, and thank you for throwing towards us some of the good questions we talked about. And I hope that the discussion you found to be very useful. And a little bit of a commercial for our next edition of OECD Green Talk Live, which will be on 19th of May. And that one will focus on climate policy data and emission outcomes. So please stay tuned. And thank you all for joining us for today's Green Talk Live. Bye. Have a nice day.